Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I hope this video finds you in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. So today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to take the opportunity to speak to you about the third and final feature film that is found in the Arrow Academy box set called Kiju Yoshida, Love plus Anarchism. Now these are films that are directed by the Japanese filmmaker Kiju Yoshida, and it has been my pleasure and honor to have been able to talk about the first two of these films in prior videos. Well, now today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to share with you some thoughts that I have with respect to the third film. This was from 1973, and the film is known in Japanese as Kaigenrei, or in English, coup d'etat. Released in 1973, written by the famed author Minoru Betsuyako and starring Rentaro Mikuni, a very famous actor, in the main role of the historical figure, the real-life figure, whose name was Ikki Kita. This is Yoshida's supreme example of a very heightened and quite dark drama, which is the film Coup d'etat. Now, to watch this film, there are perhaps a number of elements of Japanese history that I think would be very useful in knowing when going into this film. Now, as I've tried to mention in past videos with respect to the other films in this box set, there are ways, very good ways, I think, to approach the Yoshida films without necessarily needing to have a grasp on the relevant matters of Japanese history and a knowledge of the historical personages that are being dealt with in any of these films. And I really believe that. I do believe that the film Coup d'etat operates on that principle also, in that there are ways in which one can watch this film and not necessarily have all the historical details under one's belt and still get a lot out of this. Now, what do I mean? Like the other films in the set, this film has a very arresting sense of visual style, and you can tell quite immediately. And there is a sense of use of lighting and shadow and the way in which the camera frames characters as they move across the frame, etc. There are ways in which certain camera angles are shot through spinning fans, for instance, or the way in which close-ups are employed, the way in which the use of the camera conveys movement of the eyes, etc., and how this increases the tension. That's another thing too, how this film seems to be about tension and the idea of externalized pressure that is inward and internalized during these very turbulent times of Japanese history. And so these things, I think, go towards watching this film from a non-historical viewpoint, in that I do believe that one can watch this film and get a lot out of it without necessarily having all of the relevant historical details. That being said, I think that this film really offers so much when one has at least a certain degree of understanding with respect to the relevant historical details and background. And so I would strongly recommend that one gets information about some key events with respect to the history of Japan prior to the start of the Second World War. And so the idea that is being portrayed here is, first of all, we have the figure of Ikki Kita. And Ikki Kita is the main character of the film. Ikki Kita was a real-life personage of Japanese history. And according to Yoshida and David Desser and the materials that are found in the booklet, as well as other external sources, Ikki Kita was a philosopher and thinker, and one of his concerns was about social justice and how to bring about social justice to the people. And he had a very interesting and quite unique viewpoint when it came to this. I mean, I'm putting it in very simple terms, but if one is confronted with the dilemma as to how to bring about and actualize specific modes of social justice to the people in the context of the early 20th century Japanese history that was still fresh off of the Meiji Restoration, which sort of brought Japan from sort of its official feudal era thinking to a more quote-unquote modern thinking. But this is still fresh in everyone's minds in the 1930s, of course. So the idea that Kita was concerned with was how to implement this notion of social justice. And I'm being very, very basic here and very, very broad. But the answer that he seems to have reached, which is the focus of this film, is the concept of the emperor system in Japan. In other words, the emperor system is something that is existent in Japan. And by way of the emperor system, and the notion of the emperor as a kind of symbol of national character and identity of Japan, by associating with the emperor, one can bring about social change through a kind of process of revolution. So that is, in a very, very basic way, Ikki Kita's thinking. And you can get a better idea of Kita's thinking by exploring the Kiju Yoshida introduction, which is found as one of the supplements to this release, which is Essential Viewing. You can also find information about Kita through the David Desser introduction. Again, highly, highly recommended. And finally, you can get further details through this release from the Desser Scene Select commentary which he gives. And it's a very, perhaps seemingly counterintuitive concept, but it's one that creates a very interesting philosophical, not necessarily dilemma, but it's a very interesting way in which Kita tried to resolve this sort of quagmire, if you will, of theoretical thinking and social justice and socialism, and linking it to a kind of quote-unquote practicalism when it comes to the implementation of revolution. And this linking of these sort of concepts with the emperor system was something that, according to Yoshida and Desser, made Kita a very unique person in terms of his philosophy and thinking with respect to Japan during this time. And therefore, his thinking and philosophy attracted a lot of attention from the so-called right wing of Japanese politics, and a very sort of and even a kind of nationalist or ultra-nationalist faction of the Japanese political sphere, which then leads to the events of the 1930s, which of course come before the sort of the commencement or eruption, if you will, of the Second World War on a global scale, of course. So when we're focusing in on the 1930s, what we have to remember is this is a time of a kind of sort of turbulence, and there is a lot of unease and a lot of imbalance and insecurity, and there's many sort of factionalizations that are happening. But the key events that are focused on this film are, in fact, two key events. One is what's known as the May 15th incident of 1932, and the second, and perhaps the most important or most primary, that is the focus of this film, is the event called the February 26th incident of 1936. In Japanese, it's called Ni-ni-roku. Now, this film, Coup d'etat, is focusing on Kita himself, the philosopher and thinker. He wasn't a member of the military per se, and he wasn't a person that was directly involved in any of the physical acts that constituted the February 26th incident of 1936. However, it has been been said that Kita's thinking and writings may have had an influence on the movements that led to these attempted military takeovers of the government by certain factions of the Japanese military and political class. These were attempts, especially the latter, the 1936 attempted coup, which were trying to overthrow the ruling faction class of that time, and these were in the name of trying to get rid of more centralist, center-right factions within the government, and these were coups that were made or attempted by farther right actors. And so these were attempts to try, in a sense, to restore the emperor, although it's much more complicated than that. And it is said that Kita's writings or philosophies or teachings, in some form or another, even very indirectly, might have had an influence on the thinking that led to these coups, which meant that Kita, as a historical figure, became known as being someone who had some involvement with in particular the Ni-ni-roku incident, the attempted coup of February 1936. Now, this is the moment, the key moment of history that this film is dealing with. And it is this moment and the times leading up to this moment and the interactions with Kita, as played by Rentaro Mikuni, as he is interacting with various personages in the film, how he is meeting certain people. Some people are actually other non-fiction, or I should say, they're other people that actually existed in real life. Real life historical personages are depicted in this film. But also there are characters of pure fiction that are created for purposes of this film. And Kita, as played by Rentaro Mikuni, seems to be going through this landscape of the 1930s Japan, and we see a kind of inner struggle or turmoil or tension that he seems to be experiencing in terms of how he feels or what he seems to be focusing his own ideals upon, and how the people around him are acting or are planning to act in a way that may or may not be in a way that is consistent with what Kita, as portrayed by Mikuni in this film, how Kita is really thinking. And there is a great sense of ambiguity as far as Kita's allegiances in terms of how he's depicted in this film, I would argue. And that makes for a very fascinating portrait of this particular individual that really existed in Japanese history. Therefore, I think that a general knowledge of Kita and of the Ni-ni-roku, the February 26th incident of 1936, and other events that led up to this, I think might be very helpful in approaching this film. And it would be very helpful, I think, too, because it might help a viewer to get a sense of how this film is really operating, because without going into too many details, I can say that while this film does depict does try to set certain reenactments of particular aspects of the February 26th incident of 1936 and also the May 15th incident of 1932, while the film does try to portray certain aspects of these actual events, really the film's focus is less on a kind of presentation, a straightforward presentation of a historical narrative. Its focus is less on that and more on a kind of internalized analysis, a cinematic analysis, or an analysis made through cinema that is depicted as being a kind of internalized depiction or approach of Kita himself. And we see the way he speaks, the way he looks at certain things in his room, the way he is chanting Buddhist sutras, the way he has a picture of the Emperor Meiji in his lodgings, in his quarters, his interactions with his wife, his interactions with his fellow sort of circle of thinkers and his students, and how he is subtly influencing them, or how, another way to put it, or how they are subtly getting out of the control of what he is doing. There is a certain bit of subtlety and ambiguity in the way that Kita is presented here, which adds to the further ambiguity which I know exists in terms of the examination of Kita as a historical figure itself, which what makes this film very fascinating. And that ambiguity is made more potent by the fact that, once again, this film it does have certain scenes that attempt to reenact certain aspects of the coup attempt. But alongside that, this film has as its focus, I would suggest, a more internalized examination of Kita and what it is that he may or may not be about, and how he felt or may not have felt during this time in the 1930s, all the way up to the very critical event in his life, 1936, and by extension also 1937. Which is also a very critical point in time for Kita, for reasons which, for those of you who know, you know what I'm talking about. So, in other words, this film seems like it is an internalized cinematic portrait of a particular figure in history that is being affected by various external factors. It is this effect of external factors on the psyche of this particular man that is, I think, at the heart of this film. And so therefore, to bring this to a conclusion, I think that yes, on the one hand, one can view this film with a certain sense of a cinematic eye, if you will, and not necessarily have to focus on the historical matters that are at play here. But I would also suggest that having a grasp on the historical matters is very important, especially when we consider Yoshida's introduction, his comments that he makes in this introduction, that this was a very key event, and this is a very key event in that this was an event that in certain ways was a sort of precursor to the start of the war. So in that sense, it was very significant. And also, at the time of this film's release, 1973, according to Yoshida, many people would have known of Kita. Many people would have known of the so-called 226 incident of 1936, etc. So this film and what it's depicting would have been something that would have had a direct impact on viewers at the time. In other words, viewers would have known about the historical implications or the discussions that this film was making with the particular historical matters. Therefore, I think that having a grasp on the historical details, even if it's a very general sense, I think would be very, very helpful. Which means that I would strongly recommend watching the film if you haven't already. And if you are able to, then watch the Yoshida introduction, and then watch the David Desser introduction. You can watch the introductions first as well, but it's up to you. You can watch the introductions first and then the film, or you can watch the film and then the introductions. But in either case, my friends, after you have seen the introductions and the film, check out the David Desser Scene Select commentary, because it goes into detail about certain specifics of the mise-en-scène, the set decor, etc., that are very significant to this reading of the film and that add further layer to a kind of appreciation of this film on that level. So I would strongly recommend checking that out if you are able to. This film, Coup d'etat, is a masterful work. It is chilling. It is eerie. It is a very dark work. And at its core, it is talking about things that are still very relevant to Japanese society, even now, in terms of the impact of the war, the lead up to the war, and also the idea of the emperor system, etc. It's all here in this film. And at the center is a towering performance by the famous actor Rentaro Mikuni. So it's one of those majestic roles, and you get a sense of this man at the heart of this film, and also there are many mysteries that cloak this particular depiction of this person, which is fascinating. This is fascinating. This is shocking. This is something that will elicit many reactions, I'm sure, and it reaches a very unforgettable climax and conclusion that will linger long after the film is over. A very powerful work from Yoshida. This is the film Coup d'etat. It is strongly recommended. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now in terms of this film Coup d'etat. What do you think? Do you have any thoughts or comments about this film or any other films in the Yoshida box set from Arrow? If so, please feel free to let me know in the comments section below. I would very much love to hear what it is you have to say. Okay, my friends, thank you very much, and until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great movies. So until we meet again, my friends, thank you and cheers.